there's one sort of quick follow-up to um, last week's discussion. We discussed the pattern uh, that was traditionally used for denying science. That was used in attacking the polio vaccine, that was used in attacking evolution, that was used in attacking the coronavirus, that was used in attacking what else? Virtually, tobacco smoking and cancer. So interestingly, a couple of days after our class, the Senate held a hearing on hydroxychloroquine.
Oh.
And so there were 4 speakers, 3 of them selected by Republicans and 1 by a Democrat. And the 3 selected by Republicans were all proponents of hydroxychloroquine. And so they followed all of these usual patterns in denying that there was a scientific consensus, ignoring all of the research on the topic, which there is no convincing research that shows that hydroxychloroquine is effective in the treatment of COVID. And there is a good deal of evidence that shows that it can be fatal or have serious side effects for moderately and severely ill.
That was one of the drugs that President Trump had been given, right?
It was one that he took himself before he got.
But when they treated him, I
COVID.
thought that was one of the ones that they treated.
That was
him with.
remdesivir, and then
Oh,
he
that's
got
it.
some.
That's
Then he
it.
got some unauthorized, or not unauthorized, but
Ones that still,
drugs that were not yet approved.
right. Okay, remdesivir. That's what.
He
Yeah.
got well. He got well, right?
Yeah. So they attempted that they ignored and denied the validity of the evidence. And then they attacked the one person who was the only recognized epidemiologist of the 4 people for his morals, for his ethics, for presumably his connection to big pharma, which is, a big thing that the anti-vaccine people always tend to emphasize. And then their reliance on anecdotal evidence, like this has been around for 60 years, so surely it works.
Oh,
But the virus hasn't been around for 60 years. And, amputation has been around much longer, but, you don't want to do it.
Yeah.
Do it as a treatment for a brain tumor.
Wow.
So
what is the outcome of that meeting?
basically, I think none. I mean, basically none. I mean, they have no authority to authorize drugs. So, but it was just sort of symptomatic of the way in which evidence and science are dismissed, and that it does follow a pattern. There is we'll discuss it in a bit. There is sort of a relationship there to global warming. I'll read something that Patriarch Bartholomew said in a bit, but let's first I'll read the Canticle of the Creatures, or the Canticle of Brother Sun, and then we can discuss it. So it's it's called either the Canticle of Brother Sun or the Canticle of the Creatures. Most high, all powerful, good Lord, yours are the praises, the glory, the honor, and all blessing. To you alone, Most High, do they belong, and no man is worthy to mention your name. Praised be you, my Lord, with all your creatures, especially Brother Sun, who is the day and through whom you give us light. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor and bears a likeness of you, Most High One. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Moon and the stars. In heaven you form them clear and precious and beautiful. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Wind and through the air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather through which you give sustenance to your creatures. Praised be you, my Lord, through Sister Water, who is very useful and humble and precious and chaste. Praised be you, my Lord, through Brother Fire, through whom you light the night, and he is beautiful and playful and robust and strong. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister, Mother Earth, who sustains and governs us, and who produces varied fruits with colored flowers and herbs. Praised be you, my Lord, through those who give pardon for your love and bear infirmity and tribulation. Blessed are those who endure in peace, for by you, Most High, they shall be crowned. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no living man can escape. Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those whom death will find in your most holy will, for the second death shall do them no harm. Praise and bless my Lord and give him thanks and serve him with great humility.
Hmm.
So what does everyone think?
Well, he was really praising God because of all the creation. God really created all of that he's mentioning,
Mm-hmm. Right.
and he's very thankful for for all of that, like the sun and the moon, you know, that gives light and all kinds of good things.
Mm-hmm. So why does he call them creatures?
Well, maybe he thinks they're alive. What do you think?
What is a creature?
Is it a creature? Could be an animal or a person.
Somehow he thought of them as living
Yeah.
some kind of way. Maybe he didn't understand how they live, but somehow they do things on their own without, I don't know.
In
Obviously, there's
looking at
something that he's created, right? God's
that,
created.
that's it. Yeah, in the patristic tradition, the word creature, although it's typically confined to humans and to the animal kingdom, creature is something that is created by God and contrasts with God, who is not a creature. All right, so Jesus Christ is not a creature. Christ is not a creation of God. And, so that's one of the Christological debates,
Mhm.
whether Christ was a man who was promoted, or whether Christ was, in some form a lesser deity, or some such thing like that. So a creature is something created by God. So we begin to see, at least in terms of much, at least of some contemporary Christian thought, a kind of divergence where much of contemporary Christianity is homocentric, right? It focuses purely on man. And so we see here a major divergence from that. A creature isn't a human being. A creature isn't even an animal. A creature is everything that God has created.
So I have a question about, what is it, Sister Death?
Mhm.
And it said four, F-O-U-R.
Yeah, it was a typo. I apologize.
Okay.
It should have been our.
Oh, okay.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
I apologize. I should do some
It threw
proofreading.
me off. I thought, oh gosh, what does that mean?
Yeah, I actually did do proofreading, but
That's okay.
but the problem is I'm
Sorry.
not a good proofreader. When you
You know what? Proofreading your own stuff never works. You have to have
no
somebody else do it.
no when you know what's supposed to be there, you see what's there and what
Yeah.
you think
What you
is there,
thought
and not.
should be there. Yeah.
Yeah, and the divergence can be dramatic. You can see something that bears not even a remote resemblance to the sentence that. I've done that all kinds of times.
And when we dictate, sometimes it just comes out completely different from what we said.
Right.
So, yeah.
You know what you think, and you assume you say it, but you don't.
Oh, anyway,
So,
okay.
so
So Sister Death, what did he say about Sister Death?
Actually, maybe I'll keep my screen shared so that we can. Actually, first I'll try to fix that typo.
Nice though. You did a good job. There we go.
Oh, thank you. Oops. Did that too quickly. Praised be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death, from whom no living man can escape.
Okay.
Woe to those who die in mortal sin. Blessed are those whom death will find in your most holy will, for the second death shall do them no harm.
Yeah, I don't understand that part.
The second death. What they're talking about, the second death.
The second death is the first death occurs when we die.
Okay.
The second death occurs occurs when we stand before God in judgment at the end of time. So at the first death, if you're found worthy, then the second death will do you no harm.
Oh, because we're worthy.
The first and second, the notion of the second death comes from Revelation.
Oh.
Why don't we look at it? It's first of all in the message to the letter to the church in Smyrna. Starting in chapter 2, the second part of verse 10.
So this is in Revelation?
This is in Revelation.
Chapter 2. Okay.
Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who conquers shall not be hurt by the second death. So if you're faithful unto death, the first death, you get the crown of life and will not be hurt by the second death because you already have the crown of life. You're in heaven. So the resurrection happens after the final judgment. Then there's more on the second death in chapter 20 of Revelation.
Sorry, what chapter?
Chapter 20,
20.
What verse?
starting, I'm sorry, what, Connie?
What verse?
Starting at verse 4.
Hmm.
Oh, here it is. Yeah.
Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom judgment was committed. Also, I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for their testimony to Jesus and for the word of God, and who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or their hands. They came to life and reigned with Christ 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is he who shares in the first resurrection. Over such the second death has no power, but they shall be priests of God and of Christ, and they shall reign with him 1,000 years. Then the definition of the second death is found in Revelation chapter 20, verse 14.
Okay.
Starting at verse 11.
Okay.
Then I saw a great white throne and him who sat upon it. From his presence, earth and sky fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, great and small, standing before the throne, and books were opened. Also another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged by what was written in the books, by what they had done. And the sea gave up the dead in it. Death and Hades gave up the dead in them, and all were judged by what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire.
Wow.
That last reading that you read, was it the last one where they said something about beheaded?
Uh-huh.
What did that mean?
The martyrs.
Oh, okay.
There's the saint that died for Christ.
Yeah, the
Yeah,
saints
yeah,
who
yeah.
died for Christ.
Okay.
The
Mhm.
Revelation places an enormous emphasis on them. They're under the altar, and their blood is flowing under the altar. And John is, sort of very graphic. And then he says that they've been washed clean by the blood of the Lamb,
Mm.
or their robes have been washed white by the blood of the Lamb. So that's the second death. So praise be you, my Lord, through our sister bodily death. That's very unexpected. In some sense, death isn't a creature and death isn't a person, but death affects us all.
Mhm.
And death, in some sense, is an attribute of God's entire creation. So all plant and animals die at some point. All experience death. In the vegetable world, or among is it the vegetable world? Is that what it's called? Oh my goodness. In any case,
Plant
there
world?
in the plant world, there's a cycle. Thank you. There's a cycle of death and regeneration,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And in the seasons, there's a cycle of death and regeneration.
mhm.
For mammals, there, or for animals, there generally isn't a cycle of death regeneration. And for the earth, there's a cycle of erosion and change caused by mountains eroding and being destroyed, and new ones created through earthquakes and volcanoes and whatever.
And fires.
So death is equally a part of God's creation,
Mhm.
and Francis recognizes it as a creature.
Mm.
So the important thing there, I think, that he's saying is that only God is eternal. God's creation is not eternal. And in the end, even though the earth is very old and the sun is very old, nevertheless, the point to which history is moving is a new heaven and a new earth, that in some form, in a way that we can't really imagine, except that we should imagine that it's not going to be like the present world, and it's not going to be simply a good version of the present world. It will be something that is um, completely awe-inspiring, because God will be present in it, and God's entire creation will be restored in a way that God intended it to be before it became corrupted. Um, so only God is eternal. And unlike God, God's entire creation is subject to decay. Uh, it's subject to a cycle of birth and death, or a cycle of decay and renewal. So only God is eternal. All of God's creation is not. So I think that that's the significance of sister death. Um, but we also have brother sun, we have sister moon, we have brother wind, we have sister water. Now notice what he says about brother sun. And he is beautiful and radiant with great splendor, and bears a likeness of you, most high one. What does everyone think about that?
Well, it's comparing it because our Lord is the light of the world. So I think it's comparing that to that.
Uh-huh.
Like in the transfiguration,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
his clothing and he's shown.
yeah,
Uh-huh. But he's also speaking here of the Trinity in general, of God as a whole.
With all your creatures.
yeah. And bears like
Of
is most
bears the likeness of you, most high one.
high one.
Mm.
Yeah. In other words, Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit.
So the I think last week we read from Genesis that or 2 weeks ago from Genesis, God created man in his own image.
Yeah.
So what does it mean that when Francis says, and bears the likeness of you, Most High One?
Well, he's talking about Christ in the human body, right?
Yeah, but
Yeah.
the question is really what if the question really is, sort of looking at what at the
We are,
the
we are cre-
theology.
yeah, we are created
Look,
in the likeness of God. Right?
so right, he's saying that the Son bears a likeness of God,
Okay.
and implicitly, therefore, he's also saying that Sister Moon is also bears the likeness of God, and that she's clear and precious and beautiful. That also is true of God. Brother Wind gives sustenance through your creatures, cloudy and serene, giving sustenance to your creatures. God gives sustenance to all creatures and is serene and can be cloudy. That's an attribute of God. Sister Water, useful, humble, precious, and chaste. Those are all characteristics of God as well. Beautiful, playful, robust, and strong. Also characteristics of God. Sustains and governs us. Sister Mother Earth, also characteristics of God. So on the one hand, we have Genesis, which says that God made man in his image. And then we have this work of St. Francis, which attributes the attributes of God to things that are inanimate. What are we to make of that? That profoundly violates some people's sense of theology. So what are we to make of that?
Mm.
The same substance. We're all God's creation are all of the same substance.
What, Cody?
Good.
I was saying that God's creation, all of creation is of the same substance of God. So everything is God. So all from the same substance. I guess I don't know.
Mm-hmm. So all of creation bears the imprint of God. All of creation in some form bears God's image because it's all created by God.
Yes.
Humans, most of all, but nevertheless, all creation bears the image of God. All creation has some attribute of God. So if we look at God's creation, if we look at something, if we look at it usually in a way other than we usually look at it,
Yeah.
right? We can
Ra-
see
Rather than how can we use it?
rather than how can we use it. Yes, we can see some image, some imprint of God. So for me, the two classic examples that I really like are from Saint Gregory of Nyssa. Spiders.
I know you like
Spi-
that.
yeah, nobody.
I
And,
tried to
and
chase one today and he disappeared behind my buffet. And I'm not
that's
moving that whole piece of furniture just to get him.
when I see a spider, I just let it alone.
Well, it's
If
okay
it's
if he's outside.
if it's really inconvenient, I move it outside or into the garage. But
He ran away
uh,
from me.
but
Anyway,
so Saint Gregory's writing on spiders really gave me a new outlook on spiders. I now see a spider as brother spider.
Oh, I
So
never heard of that.
so Gregory wrote that. So he wrote that all things give honor and glory to God. All things praise God through their existence if we just bother to notice. And so he has two examples, spiders and stinging insects, right? Spiders are, these usually tiny, insignificant little creatures, and yet they build these magnificent webs. And when their webs are torn down, they build them again.
Yeah.
And they're, magnificent webs. They're real works of architecture and engineering from an insignificant little insect. Well, they're not insects, whatever they are, spiders.
They never
So,
gave up. They never gave up. They keep going back and building it.
right, and their construction is beautiful. So that is an imprint of God. It's because they have been created to do that by God and built, and therefore contain some part of the divine image. Similarly, stinging insects, the one who are hive builders, they build these beautiful, intricate hives for themselves to live in. They work cooperatively. Their hives are modern feats of are modern, not modern, are major feats of engineering. Yet, they're individually insignificant, from our point of view, little insects.
What is it?
They are insects, at least.
Hive.
So
Um,
that's, they've been imprinted to do that by God. So in some form, they bear some attributes of God. So, what Saint Francis is saying here is that the homocentric view of of Christianity is that um, it's all about, first of all about man. Second, all about redemption. And third, for many Christians, all about God's blessing for me. None of those things are really a part of a patristic tradition. They're not a part of the faith. And they're really very dangerous because the world around us becomes an object of our exploitation and appropriation. And also, therefore, unfortunately, people around us similarly become objects of our exploitation and appropriation because it becomes about us. So it becomes a fundamentally flawed theology and a flawed approach to the faith. So as Pope Francis says, we are all intimately united with all that exists. So questions about that? Any thoughts? Any comments?
Mm. But you got any question? Okay.
I think he's just giving honor to all that God has made and showing his appreciation for it.
Hmm. But more than that, he's saying that we're intimately connected to it.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really, really very important. As you know, you can praise things that you're going to use, like
Yeah.
thank you, Lord, that you've given me this nice car.
Mm. But these are
Thank you,
all
Lord, that
natural items. These are things.
This is, yeah, things that belong to earth for our use.
Yeah.
If we use it,
Wisely.
abuse it.
Yeah.
mhm.
We're still learning how to use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
But for brother wind, through which you give sustenance to your creatures. So brother wind in the air gives sustenance not only to us, but to everybody, to all of God's creation. And the the important thing is that it's not only for us, that all of God's creation
Yeah.
is interdependent, that we fit within a context of a creation that's created by God, and we're all intimately connected, but separate from it. We're not masters of it, we're not lords over it. We're a part of it and we're dependent on it. So that's in many ways, I think what Francis is conveying. He also I think I mentioned this last time, but he's always depicted as being around animals, birds and squirrels and rodents.
Yeah.
And in fact, he had, that's accurate. He in fact had a real love for all of God's creatures, for um, all animals, for I think I mentioned last week that there's a story about him speaking to a fish that had been caught. It had been hooked by somebody, and he took the fish away and told the fish not to do that again and put it in the water. So a real love of God's creation that transcended um, simply.
So
Um,
he's a vegetarian. Is that what we're telling? Is that what
I
we're
would
telling?
guess he was.
Yeah. But still, even that, I mean, he had to know that this was a gift to mankind that God wanted us to enjoy
Hmm.
and to sustain ourselves with.
Right. No, that's certainly true. But the question is, in what is our relationship to the things that sustain us?
Not very good.
And right, not very good.
Not very good.
And so
Well,
the
sure, it's
question
good.
is,
It gives us protein. It helps us keep healthy.
Yeah, but we waste a lot of that stuff. Like, for
Yeah,
example, the
yeah,
water.
yeah.
Look at all these hotels and stuff that, yeah, swimming pools, stuff like that.
I know, I know.
yeah, I mean, there are a number of um, one of the things that always really, well, first of all, in some ways, in America, the measure of success is how much you can waste,
Yeah.
right? And one of the things among Christians that just drives me crazy is that you say grace, right?
Mhm.
And then don't eat the food because you don't like it. What is that supposed to mean?
You already blessed it. You're supposed to eat it.
You thank God for the food. So
Yeah.
evidently the food that God provided you isn't good enough.
Yeah.
So God is not doing his job. That's outrageous. That's an act of blasphemy.
Mm.
And yet, I've seen that time after time after time. Eat the food. It's not, it's not hard.
Yeah.
Who cares if you don't like it? As long as it's, not spoiled, you eat the food or you commit an act of blasphemy. I mean, that's, my opinion, but for myself, I would, if I did that, I would promptly go to confession.
Well, my plate's always clean. And I think I eat almost everything. I mean, I wouldn't buy something unless I really wanted it anyway. I mean, I wouldn't. I don't know. I
Yeah,
don't. I that was never an issue for me. I never had. I never left food on the plate.
yeah, it was never an issue for me either, actually. And if there were any sauce or whatever left, I let Yuma lick my plate.
Oh, there you go. Somebody's
He
got to enjoy
enjoys
it.
that. And if he can, he'll steal my food.
There you go.
So the really important thing is that we're an interconnected part of creation. We're one part of God's creation. And it has been put here for our use, just as it's been put there for the use of every other living thing. And so we have to recognize that our relationship to God's creation is not one of domination, but one of stewardship and sustenance, that we're responsible for sustaining God's creation, just as we're sustained by God's creation. So we have to ensure that the diversity and the beauty of God's creation continues. That's a really important part of I think the message that St. Francis is trying to convey, and that the Holy Father is trying to convey in his encyclical. So after mentioning Laudato Si, the Laudato Si was translated as in the writing, "Praised be you, my Lord." He then discusses Pope John's encyclical Pacem in Terris. He then goes on to discuss some of the writing of Saint Pope Paul VI. Then he goes on to discuss some of the work of Saint John Paul II, and then of Pope Benedict XVI. Why does he do that? Why does he do Pope St. John the 23rd? Why does he mention his encyclical Pacem in Terris?
That this is something that has been tried to be and presented before as to how we need to think seriously about our planet. But I mean,
Mhm.
yeah, I mean, it's not the first time.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's
less for
what
for
century?
Pacem.
What
I'm
century is that? The Pope Saint John, the
down
23rd.
the 23rd,
That was
1960s. I think he died in about 1963, I think,
Mhm, I think so.
64. I
Yeah, they were saying that the global environmental deterioration started there when he wrote this Pacem in Terris.
mhm,
Yeah, so it's not really new.
Mhm.
right.
Right? It was a subject of most of the encyclical of the Pope.
Right. So, and for Pacem and Terris, he actually is trying to show that so one of there are um, there there actually have been in many ways two lines of critique of the encyclical. The first is that he's um, he's directing it to everybody, right? So, when
Yeah,
he introduced it, he included on the panel an atheist as well as a number people from other faith traditions, uh, and scientists and an
yeah,
atheist, and so the critique is that this doesn't that he's reaching out into all of the to the secular world when that's not something that the Pope should be doing. But the important thing about Pacem in Terris is that it was directed at all people of goodwill. So, regardless of faith, uh, to those of different faiths, to those Christians with different beliefs, uh, to non-Christians, to non-believers, to agnostics, to atheists. It doesn't really matter. The point of Pacem and Terris is that we're at that point the possibility of a nuclear catastrophe seemed overwhelming,
yeah,
and
because we're all affected with it.
and
Mm,
so all people of goodwill have to unite to ensure that there's not a nuclear catastrophe, that there's not an outbreak of nuclear war.
mm,
So it is in fact in keeping with the responsibility of the Pope, and in fact in keeping with the responsibility of any Christian, that we're to be a voice to all people. And when we confine ourselves to ourselves, then we sort of end up preaching to the choir, or even worse, often become encapsulated and get a really distorted view of what we're doing,
right.
and a distorted view of our own importance. So then he goes on from Pacem and Terris, from Pope Saint John the 23rd to uh, Pope Paul VI, and then to Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict, to show that they too have been concerned with ecological issues, that that his encyclical doesn't really break new ground. It simply draws on and expands on the existing work of those three popes. so he's really saying that rather than, being discontinuous with Catholic social teaching, that Laudato Si is very much in keeping with Catholic social tradition, teaching.
And he was saying even outside the Catholic Church, Patriarch Bartholomew also had concerns. So he, even though he wasn't part of the Catholic Church, he had the same concerns.
Right. Yeah.
So it's just all people should be.
Concern. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. We're being
Right. He mentions, he mentions, the growing movement of, for preservation of the environment from people of other faiths and people of no faith.
Mm.
And then he specifically mentions Patriarch Bartholomew a
Mhm.
good deal. Patriarch Bartholomew is the Patriarch of Constantinople.
Oh, he was Catholic then.
No, he's Greek Orthodox.
Oh, Greek Orthodox.
Yeah.
Okay.
So he's the Patriarch of Constantinople. So Patriarch of Constantinople is kind of the first among equals, sort of very much like the Anglican Church, as say in Scotland, the Bishop of Edinburgh is the first among equals, and in the Anglican Church in England, I think it's like the Bishop of Canterbury
Mm.
is the first among equals. So it's the
Okay. Mhm.
leading patriarch, but not
But not the Roman
not
Catholic Church.
but not all, but not having the power of, say, the Bishop of Rome.
Okay.
So Patriarch Bartholomew has been a major environmental activist. He regularly had organized conferences. He regularly speaks about the environment. It's really,
Hmm.
really a common theme. So, questions about that? A really major critique from Catholics has been that Francis is meddling into affairs that are none of his business,
Oh my God.
that he should confine himself to religion,
Mhm.
and that this is just an overreach into, areas in which, he shouldn't meddle. Thoughts about that?
Mm, yeah. Good.
Part of God's creation.
I'm a creature.
God said he's a creature.
That's right. There you go.
Yeah.
We're yeah, and practically, as followers of Christ, it's our responsibility to be a voice for whatever needs to be articulated, a
Yeah.
voice for the oppressed,
Yeah.
a voice for,
I like
and
this paragraph. He said, everyone's talents and involvement are needed to redress the damage caused by human abuse of God's creation.
right, hmm right, and that damage is serious,
Yeah.
and that damage is possibly going to is that
It's getting
damage may
worse.
well threaten the existence of Earth,
Yeah.
in which case
Human,
we all die.
the only part of creation that is abusive.
What, Cody?
Is the human race the only part of God's creation that is abusive?
Yeah, Yes,
Yeah,
unfortunately,
fortunately, yeah.
the you know the difference between humans and the other
Creation.
members of the animal kingdom is that they can behave in the way in which God has, I think so they can behave in the way in which God has allowed them to behave. So I mean, admittedly, there are, you know, enormous variations within a species, but nevertheless, they have some basic common attributes
Yeah.
that God has instilled in them. And things like greed are not among them. I mean, they behave in fairly predictable ways within a range of behaviors.
Well, even in the wild kingdom, a wild animal kingdom, the lions only kill what they need to eat, and that's it. They
Right,
don't just go killing all animals, you know,
right,
left, right, and center, and then just leave them to rot.
right,
Only what they need.
Man's the
right.
only one that does that.
And where things are, where generally, if there are any parts remaining, something else comes to eat them.
Right.
One of the interesting things that nobody has, which is probably related to that, which is uh, true of wolves, is that ravens typically live with wolves,
Mm.
and
They eat
so
the leftovers. Yeah.
so they'll come and they'll actually mess with the wolves and pull on their hair, and the wolves will
Tolerate it.
ravens will eat any part of a carcass that's left over, and they
What about the
probably
birds that
also
go on their backs? I mean,
they
the
probably also
elephant,
pull off
or
fleas.
yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah, and they're
So
eating, yeah,
so there's a symbiotic relationship
yeah.
among animals. Um,
And we're the ones with the most brains, and we're the ones that abuse everything.
right, right. Yeah, yeah. So lions don't look for superior weapons to slaughter elk or each other for that matter.
Exactly.
Uh,
Yeah, maybe they want power over a female, but they might kill another male so that they have,
That happens with lions and tigers
yeah, yeah,
yeah,
when they're mating.
yeah.
I know in the deer and the elk, they always have 2 or 3 does in one family. Like say you have
uh-huh,
a herd of elk,
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
yeah,
then the females belong to, like 3 or 4 females belong to one buck or one bull, so to speak. Um, so whenever you see a herd of elk, then you can actually dissect it down to families of 3 females and one buck, and then all
uh-huh,
the streams just kind of go their own way, and it'll become the same. So
yeah,
um,
That's interesting.
yeah. That's
Interesting.
it's an interesting thing. I mean, some mating patterns are very different. There are also some animals that are monogamous, and many die, refuse to eat, refuse to go on living if their mate is killed,
Wow.
which
Yeah.
is really sad. That's true often of ducks, and it's true of crows.
I don't think animals have free will, but they're smart because, like in the bears, the Oregon bear, the brown bear, and in Northern
Uh-huh.
California, the male bear will eat the babies, so the mother bear hides the babies until they're big enough to where In other words, after the babies are born, they separate. There's a separation period because the father will kill the young. And,
Uh-huh.
you know, I never quite understood,
Shame on him.
you know, how all that works. But
Yeah.
But don't get
So-
between a mother and her cubs. You could be it next.
It usually happens when people are doing stupid things.
Yeah.
Generally, if you leave bears alone, especially brown bears, then they'll leave you alone. They have very little interest
Mhm.
in people.
well, even in the animal kingdom that's not carnivorous, like cows and sheep, and
Mhm.
if a sheep has triplets, which does happen, then she will only feed 2 of them. So the farmer is going to have to raise one of them because the mother won't feed him.
Really?
What is there, like when I was growing up, we would, every November when the sheep were born, all the ones that had triplets, the mother would only feed 2 of them. So we had to hand feed the extra one.
Huh.
Uh-huh.
And most of the time, deer and sheep, they always have twins. There's more twins in that. So there's something that they know there,
Yeah.
that
we don't
that
know.
become, I guess you would put it in the category of instinct, but man can save those ones that, like in the domesticated animals, like cows and chickens and sheep and all the above,
Wow. Yeah.
Hmm.
I didn't know that.
And they
Uh-huh.
won't feed them if
That-
they have 3. It's very, I don't know if they know they don't have enough to feed 3 or what, but they won't feed them.
Hmm.
So I remember every year we had 3 or 4 baby lambs that we would be feeding ourselves.
Oh. Hmm.
So in many ways,
Free will though, right, Ron?
what, Cody?
They have free will?
No.
No, they don't have free will. People have free will. That's a blessing and a
Free will is
curse.
only a human defect.
Yeah. So looking at this from the viewpoint of theology, this is, especially, I guess you could say, modern theology. I mean, St. Francis is very much, I think, in keeping in the patristic tradition, which saw creation as a unified whole. There was a real cosmology and a real understanding of man's place in the cosmos, rather than this very homocentric view. And so we see it in the view that only the homocentric view, we see it in the notion that only man is made in God's image. And we also see it, for example, in using a literal interpretation. In Exodus, God makes man from, let's see if I can find my notes. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 7, it says, the Lord God formed man from the dust of the ground. So there's a homocentric way of understanding that and a non-homocentric way. the homocentric way is that God took some dust and made Adam,
Yeah, form.
right? And then extracted the rib and created Eve, and then somehow things mushroomed, and even though that evidently would be considered an act of incest, but how else can we understand it?
Creation. It's not, it's the beginning of man's creation. Man was created, and then woman was basically designed in the same way that man was.
Well, we can look at it as not a literal description, but a theology. We in the apologetics class, we had discussed really that the Bible is not a science textbook. Genesis is not a science textbook. It's not a literal account of anything. It's a theology, and it's about God and the relationship of man to God. So here, Adam's being formed from the dust of the ground doesn't mean that God took a bunch of dust or clay or dirt and poof, here came Adam. It means that we are composed of the elements found in the earth. So from dust to dust, from ashes to ashes. I mean, that's not a biblical quotation, but it is based on Abraham, who identified himself as but dust and ashes when he, was bargaining with God to spare Sodom and Gomorrah from punishment. So it's not a description, but a theology. And so that, like all living things, we come from the earth, we're sustained by the earth, and we return to the earth. So we're part of God's natural cycle of creation and God's natural cycle of decay and regeneration, of death and regeneration and renewal. So that's really important. That's a real divergence from the homocentric path. Then there's also, especially among evangelicals, there's this view that only, a very hardcore view, only Jesus Christ provides the path to salvation. So on the one hand, that contains a truth, but only an element.
Because Christ himself said, I am the way, the
Right.
truth, and the life.
And right. And who is Christ?
God.
And what else?
He's the second
What is,
person in the Trinity.
how does John identify him?
Son. Son of God. The Messiah.
At the very beginning of John's gospel,
He's the Word
he's the Word,
made flesh.
right? And what does the Word do? Remember in the beginning.
It was the prophecy.
In the beginning was the Word was made flesh.
Yeah.
And
the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah.
So what is the implication of his being the Word? What does the Word do? the word becomes flesh, but that's not the entirety of the word or the entire significance of the word. So remember, John begins his gospel with "in the beginning,"
Mhm.
and that "in the beginning" is in Greek the same phrase "in the beginning" that Genesis begins with. So he wants to draw our attention to Genesis. And so what happens in Genesis? What is the creative process by which the cosmos is created? It's that God the Father conceives, God, the Word of God, speaks,
Mhm.
and God the Spirit hovers and creates.
Mhm.
So it's a threefold process. So the Word speaks things into existence,
Mhm.
right? So
From all
all
eternity. Yeah.
all creation has been created by the Word, by all three persons of the Trinity, but nevertheless by the Word speaking it into existence. And so in the patristic tradition, we can come to a knowledge of God simply by observing the world around us. We can come to a knowledge of God by observing that others bear the divine image. We can come to a knowledge of God by watching a spider.
Mhm.
All things testify and point to God.
It says God
So,
created all things through the Word, who is
right.
Christ, and makes himself known through his creation.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So that's a movement away from this sort of really harsh homocentric view toward a view that is much more in keeping with uh, the church's traditions, in keeping with the church's teaching, in keeping with the patristic tradition. The at one point, um, Pope Francis mentions an address that Pope Benedict gave um, to it's a group of Australian priests and seminarians, and so one of the priests who is a moral or was a moral theologian asks what what can be done to address ecological issues, because although a number of he himself and a number of other Catholics are very active in the ecological movement, they're generally met with either hostility or no positive reception. And so Pope Benedict talks about in his response. I mean, this was an audience with Pope Benedict. Talked about how um, we tend to focus on redemption, and so the result of focusing on redemption is that the effect of redemption is salvation, right?
Yeah.
So we focus on our personal salvation, and in that we become lost, because it's really not about our personal salvation, and it's not about only redemption. It's about creation and redemption. And the ultimate goal, is not that we go to heaven. The ultimate goal is that there be a new heaven and a new earth, and that creation be redeemed. So, in order to, sort of arrive at that, we have to abandon our kind of notions of redemption and refocus them so that we focus on both creation and redemption and the renewal of all things. So unfortunately, we're out of time, but why don't we close by reading from the book of Revelation? So in some form that we don't understand, creation has become disordered through us. Paul talks about all creation groaning. And Isaiah talks about in the famous passage, the lion lying down with the lamb and little children picking up asps. So that, in some sense, represents a view of how life should have been and what a restored creation will look like. So let's look at the new heaven and the new earth in Revelation chapter 21. Verse 1.
Okay.
Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away, and the sea was no more. Sea is a metaphor, incidentally, for the restless Gentile nations.
Paganism.
Paganism. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice from the throne saying, "Behold, the dwelling of God is with men. He will dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and death shall be no more. Neither shall there be mourning, nor crying, nor pain any more, for the former things have passed away." And he who sat upon the throne said, "Behold, I make all things new." So the former things have passed away. We can't even begin to imagine what that is, but it's not about this homocentric approach. It's about a renewal of all God's creation. It's about the lamb lying down with the lion, as Isaiah said in his prophetic vision. So that's in some ways, I think, the challenge that Pope Francis is posing to us in the introduction, that we, sort of struggle with moving away from this homocentric view, which is really badly embedded in all of us, and also is really badly embedded in Christianity and in some faith traditions within Christianity more than others, but nevertheless embedded. So we're out of time. Are there questions or thoughts or comments?
Oh, that was good. How far do you want us to read for next week?
Read chapter 1.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I started that. I was page 29. I can reread it again. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what
Yeah.
I'm going to do.
Very,
Yeah.
very interesting reading, and it's easy to read. It's easy reading.
Yeah, it's a description of sort of the issues that we confront.
Right. Yeah.
And then in chapter 2, he begins to try to develop the theology underlying the
How to solve the problem.
the crisis.
Yeah.
And so it's both really important to understand the magnitude of the crisis that we face. Also, and we tend often to sort of not be theological. And so we often don't recognize that there's a theology behind everything we do.
Exactly.
And often when we don't realize that, we express bad theology.
Yeah.
So, kind of a theological awareness and sort of a sense of, it also just really, a sense of, well, as St. Francis had, our connectedness with all of creation rather than our separation from it is important. And also, which I think Laudato Si clearly, St. Francis's work clearly indicates also a real connection to the patristic tradition, which he expresses in a very unique way, but still very clearly, a reflection of patristic tradition, and especially of say the Cappadocians and of Saint Gregory.